going to talk about equivalent fractions. So in this lesson, your vocabulary word is going to be equivalent. So go ahead and take out your vocabulary journals, and if you will, write down the word equivalent. And you need to know that equivalent means equal amount or value. So how does the word equivalent relate to fractions? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at today. First of all, I want you to notice that I have two rectangles drawn here, and both look to be the same size. You're going to notice in this first rectangle, it is divided in half, so we have two equal parts, and you'll notice that I have shaded in the top part. So in other words, we have one part shaded of the two parts of the rectangle, or 1/2. So this rectangle could be represented by the fraction 1/2. Now let's take a look at the other rectangle. You're going to notice in this rectangle that there are 4 parts. So in this rectangle, you'll notice that I have about the same amount shaded in, but because this is divided into 4 parts, our fraction that represents this rectangle is 2 parts that are shaded of the 4 parts of the rectangle, or 2/4. So in talking about equivalent fractions, we could say that these two rectangles are equivalent. They're the same size, but because of the way we divided them, this one is 1/2 and this one is equal to 2/4. But you'll notice that 1/2, the fraction, is actually equivalent or equal to 2/4, the fraction. So it's pretty easy to talk about equivalent fractions when we have drawings or images like these two rectangles. But how do we do this when we do not? How do we come up with equivalent fractions when we do not have a drawing or an image? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's lesson. So here we are, and we must create equivalent fractions. So let's take a look at this equivalent fraction here. How are we going to turn this into an equivalent fraction? We have the fraction 3/8. This time we don't have a drawing. And we want to turn it into a fraction that's equivalent to it that has the denominator 16. Now, one thing that we know about equivalent fractions is that we can get an equivalent fraction by either multiplying or by dividing. And what we need to do is, if the denominator is larger than the denominator in the other fraction that we're working with, and we want to make these equivalent, because this is larger, we know we're going to need to multiply. So let's think about what we could multiply times 8 to get 16. And if you know your fraction facts, then you know that if we take 2 and multiply it by 8, we will have 16. Now, one of the rules of equivalent fractions is whatever we do to the denominator, we also have to do the same thing to the numerator. So, because of that, we're going to also multiply it by 2. So 3 times 2 is going to give us 6. And so now we have an equivalent fraction. 3/8 is equivalent to 6/16. Okay, let's try another one, shall we? Keep in mind this multiplication and division is how we're always going to get our equivalent fractions. I'm going to erase this for right now. We're going to try another one. So let's take the fraction 4/8, and let's see if we can find an equivalent fraction 4/8, and this time let's have the numerator of 1. Okay, now we're going to notice that here is our numerator, so we're going to be dealing with numerators this time instead of denominators, and we're going to notice that our numerator on this side is larger than the numerator on that side. And remember earlier when we had a denominator that was smaller than the denominator on this side, we said we had to use multiplication. So that's going to tell us that this time we're going to have to use division. So what would we divide 4 by to get 1? And we know that that would be 4. We know that from our division and multiplication facts. So then we're going to have to do the same thing because the rule says whatever we do to the denominator, or pardon me, in this case the numerator, we must also do to the denominator. Or whatever we do to the top, we also have to do to the bottom. We're going to divide 8 by 4. And when we do that, we're going to get what? That's right, 2. So here we have the equivalent fraction of 4/8 is 1/2. So now it's time for you to try some problems on your own. And you can do this in box 3 of your homework sheet. So for problem number 1, we have 2/3 being equivalent to something over 9. Problem number 2, you have 4/6 being equivalent to something over 12. In problem 3, you have 3/8 being equivalent to something over 16. And in problem 4, you have 1/2 being equivalent to 4 over something. So remember, you can always review the tape to determine how to come up with your answers for equivalent fractions, when to multiply, when to divide. And good luck with this, and do your best.